welcome back to Rusted Horsepower. So my Chevelle's motor is still sitting on the engine stand, still needing to get some of those oil leaks taken care of. I finally set aside some time to go ahead and work on it, so let's get started on that. Alright, so I got a majority of the teardown out of the way. So some of the obvious things that I had to do is I had to drain all the oil. I removed the carburetor because I knew I was going to hang the engine upside down. I didn't want any fuel dripping or any kind of carburetor issues. I also had to knock off the oil pan to get in there. Some of you might be wondering why I took off the alternator and the power steering belts, and the reason for that is I didn't want any extra tension on the crankshaft because I'm going to be checking crankshaft to bearing clearances. A while back this engine did have some crankshaft to bearing clearance issues, so I'm just going to go ahead and take advantage, and while the oil pan's off, go ahead and double check all those. Before that though, I'm going to be cleaning all the mating surfaces and all the threaded bolt holes. So now with the mating surfaces and all the threaded bolt holes clean, we're going to move on to checking crankshaft clearance. In order to do that, we got to move the oil pump out of the way and then remove all the main caps. Although there are different ways to measure crankshaft clearance, what I'm going to be using to do that is using Plastigage. Plastigage, the way it works is it's basically a little wax strip, and you put a piece of that strip on each one of the crankshaft mains. Then you're going to put down each one of the corresponding caps with the bearing at each one of their places, torque them down, do not turn the crankshaft, then you take them back off, and you're going to see how much that little wax strip got smashed. Depending on what your paper says, you measure it against the side, wherever it matches, that's going to tell you what your clearance is. Basically, if it's smashed too much, there's less clearance. If it's not smashed enough, it has more clearance. You want to check whatever the number is versus your specs. If it's squashed too much or not enough, you're going to have issues, whether you're going to end up needing an oversized bearing, replace a crankshaft, or get a crankshaft turned. So with the crankshaft mains wiped off, all the little bit of oil residue off of the mains, off of the bolt holes, off of any surface where it's going to torque down. Same thing with the main caps. You wipe them off, take any oil off. Now you can go ahead and put down your Plastigage and torque them to spec. On this motor, the spec is 75 foot-pounds. So before checking main bearing clearances, I decided to give them a real quick visual inspection. What I found was that some of the bearings had really light scratches on them. I also found that the crankshaft had some weird staining, kind of similar to pitting on mains 1, 3, and 5. It was a really thin partial ring close to the center of the main. It's kind of odd considering I had already cleaned this crankshaft before I put it in several years ago. So I decided to go ahead and check the rod bearings as well. The rod bearings were pretty smooth, no scratches. And in order to check the clearances on the rods, it's a little bit more of a process. You got to bring two rods up, pull their caps off, put your Plastigage down, torque the caps back on, take them off again, check your Plastigage, clean off your Plastigage, put the caps back on, torque them, and then rotate the engine to the next set of two rods. You got to do two rods at a time. If you try to put Plastigage on all the rods at the same time, you're only going to smear your Plastigage whenever you turn your engine. That's going to give you an inaccurate reading. So in the process of doing this, I ended up seeing something kind of disturbing. And I had already seen this the last time I took this engine apart, which is rod number 4 has some kind of weird discoloration on it. And originally I thought this discoloration just meant this rod came from another engine and maybe it didn't get regular oil changes and it just caused some kind of staining from sitting in old oil. Now that I know a little bit more, I do believe that this theory still works, that it came from another engine, but this discoloration, this darkening is more of a heat stress. I know that most likely what happening is a bearing or crankshaft failed on this rod, caused it to get hot. The reason it still works as far as the theory that it came from another engine is because none of the other parts have this heat stress, not the crankshaft or any of the rods. Not even the rod that's right next to it on the same journal. It would have shared some of that heat stress if it came from this engine. So, like I said, it's kind of disturbing, and in order to replace this rod, I'd have to remove the intake and cylinder head and pull the piston out. It's not that big of a deal, seeing as how far the engine's apart right now and sitting on an engine stand. It's just something I'm not going to tackle right now. So as far as how I get my specs for clearances, most of the time I go to my old manuals. I have old manuals I reference versus going to the internet or word of mouth. The reason I do that is because these numbers I believe are tried and true and I can trust them. They're accurate. So most of the clearances on the engine were around 2000s. Some of the tighter ones might have been closer to 1910,000s or 1810,000s. That's still closer to 2000s. So most of these manuals are set up with a production and a service spec. Production spec basically means these are new parts. It's a new block, new crankshaft, new rods, new bearings. Never been used before. Service spec means the engine's already been run, these are old parts, you're just basically checking them to see if they're still good. Basically, production is a more strict spec and service gives you a little bit more leeway. Under 2000s, most of these parts, as far as main and rod, they pass production spec, meaning that their clearance is still very close to being new parts. Now there was a little bit of a discrepancy between the 1969 manual and the 1972 manual. The 72 manual, although they still passed specs, they were closer to the end, kind of like right at the limit, especially for that front main. But either way, they still passed, there's still good enough clearance. So now with the rotating assembly back together and lubed, the next thing to do is replace the rear main seal, put the oil pump back on, torque it down. But before putting the oil pan back on, resealing everything, I'm going to roll the engine over, take care of the oil leaks up top, namely the oil pressure sender. So the motor's pretty much back together. All the clearances for the rotating assembly came out alright. I replaced the rear main seal. I went ahead and replaced the oil pan gasket. I resealed the oil pressure sender. So all those leaks are basically resealed. The carburetor still off of the motor, and I won't be putting the carburetor back on until once the motor's back in the car, just to simplify things. The motor mount still got to be swapped from the mock-up block back onto the motor, but I'll wait until right before I drop the engine back in. The last thing left is the cast aluminum Corvette valve covers. So I wanted to basically ID these valve covers and see what year they came out of. Were they original Corvette or are these just reproduction? But basically I looked up on eBay and I did find sets that were similar to them. The one thing that I noticed is most of those valve covers, they were solid all the way across. They didn't have holes for an oil filler or for a PCV valve. So the most I can gather is these valve covers were modified. They were cut up and somebody modified them. They did a pretty good job because you could hardly even tell. They didn't even go over the word Corvette or anything. So I came across this one video that by some Corvette purists talked about nothing but valve covers throughout the years. And around 55 I start seeing similar valve covers, and they have a 9-fin design. And then around 57 I start seeing a 7-fin design. I see cutouts for the fuel injection intake. So I went to look at these valve covers, and they are 7-fin, and they do have the cutouts for the fuel injection intake, which is pretty cool. So now I know they're 57 and up. Then I also start watching the video, and the Corvette script also kind of leads you to what year they are. They had a low script, and around 59 they went to a high script. So these have a high script. Okay, so they're 59s. Then I start seeing where in 59 they had the straight ahead bolts and they had the staggered bolts. Most of them before that were staggered bolts, but in 59 some of them had straight ahead bolts. So I started thinking, what are they talking about here? So here's where it gets complicated. Straight ahead bolts means that they bolt up like any other small block Chevy valve cover. They have the bolts in the same location. Staggered bolts, leave it to Chevrolet or leave it to Corvette to do this. Staggered bolts have the 2 upper bolts in the standard small block Chevy valve cover location, and the 2 lower bolts are set further out. So these staggered bolt valve covers won't bolt up to a small block Chevy head, a standard small block Chevy head. So I started looking at these, and remember, when I got these valve covers there were 2 sets, and one of the valve covers had already been destroyed for aluminum, and then my buddy stepped in and said, hey, hold on, these are cool looking valve covers, I'll take them. Then he ended up giving them to me. So they were originally 2 sets. So I checked the valve covers, and one of them has straight ahead bolts, meaning the bolt holes are in the standard locations. The other one had staggered bolts. So I think to myself, what are the chances of the valve cover that I've already got mounted here on the wall is a straight ahead bolt valve cover? And I figured it was most likely going to be a staggered bolt valve cover, and sure enough, once I checked it, I verified it is a staggered bolt valve cover. So what I end up having is 1 straight ahead bolt valve cover and a set of 2 staggered bolt hole valve covers that will only bolt up to an early model Corvette small block Chevy head. I could bolt just that 1 valve cover onto this engine and make a Frankenstein engine, if you would, but there's no way that one of the other valve covers will bolt up to the other side. About this point is usually where I tell my kids, wah, wah, wah. But you know, they still make some great looking wall art though. And you never know, sometime in the near future I might run into the another side of that straight ahead bolt valve cover and make a full set again. It's kind of disappointing. They would have looked really cool in this engine. There's some good looking valve covers. I was really looking forward to it. But Anyways, I hope you guys had a happy new year. For 2023, I'm hoping to put out more videos within next coming weeks. The next thing I'm going to do is clean up the engine compartment and do some stuff with the brake lines. The engine should be fired up pretty soon, and sometime after that I should be doing some driving videos again. But I just wanted to say thanks a lot for watching. I really appreciate you guys hanging around, and God bless you.